The SEC slate is out for South Carolina's women's basketball team. And while they've got some tough games on the docket this next season, I think overall they got a pretty fair draw.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also the lead publisher for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both wherever you get your audio podcasts daily and also on YouTube. We're going to talk a little bit of hoops and a little bit of football on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Gamecocks. We're going to talk about an interesting portal method that Shane Beamer is using right now to try and add a bit of insurance at a pivotal position group on the offensive side of the ball. Plus, Bill Connolly of ESPN has released his annual returning production numbers for all 134, I want to say, FBS football programs. Where does South Carolina rank, and how much stock should we put into their returning production numbers? But before we get into all of that, I want to talk about the SEC schedule that has been released for South Carolina's women's basketball team this next season. Now, while the schedule definitely includes some pretty tough and intriguing games for South Carolina, both at home at the Colonial Life Arena and also on the road, I would say overall the schedule is pretty fair for Dawn Staley and South Carolina. Now, as far as the home and away games go, the Gamecocks are playing Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, Kentucky, LSU, Oklahoma, and Texas A&M all at home this next season. On the road, they'll be playing Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi State, Missouri, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt. The one team that they will have a home-and-home with this next season will be the Texas Longhorns, led, of course, by Vic Schaefer. So, when you break down the away slate and the home slate in conference play for South Carolina in the 2025 season, I would say that, again, it's pretty fair because when you look at the home slate, South Carolina is going to face 5 opponents who made the NCAA Tournament this past season. Those 5 teams being Auburn, LSU, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, and Texas. They also will be facing Kentucky, and the reason that I throw Kentucky in there at the very end is because obviously they've now got Kenny Brooks, who came over from Virginia Tech. Brooks led the Hokies to the Final Four just 2 seasons ago and made that program relevant really for the first time on a national scale. And so I expect Kentucky, with this new era of the transfer portal, to immediately be challenging some of the teams that are in the top half of the league, or at least have been over the past couple years. So I think that it'll be an intriguing matchup for Gamecock fans to watch, simply because the Wildcats are probably going to be a lot better from this point moving forward under Kenny Brooks. Now, when you look at the road schedule for South Carolina, just like their home slate, they're facing 5 opponents who made the NCAA Tournament this past season. Those 5 teams on the road will be Alabama, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, and again, Texas, because that is the one team South Carolina has a home-and-home with. As far as the big 3 go, and the big 3 in this case I'm talking about is South Carolina, LSU, and Texas. I think those are far and away the best 3 programs right now in the SEC, and the behind them is sort of a bit of a revolving door. But looking at those 3 teams, obviously take South Carolina out of it because we're talking about South Carolina, but with LSU and Texas, the Gamecocks have 3 games against those 2 teams. 2 of those games are going to be at the CLA. So when you take all of that into consideration, I think that South Carolina got a very fair draw. They don't have a ridiculously tough road schedule, at least compared to other teams. So the SEC did not just basically challenge their top program in the sport with just a ridiculous slate on that end, but they also did not give them something relatively easy where the rest of the conference would have been all up in arms if they saw, say, South Carolina was playing just Texas at home and then LSU, maybe throw in an Ole Miss and a Tennessee. If they had gotten all of those teams at home, yeah, the rest of the SEC women's basketball fans, they would have had something to say about that. So I think that the league overall did a pretty good job of just splitting it right down the middle, where South Carolina's got a good slate of home games and also a somewhat tough slate of road games, with the toughest, in my opinion, definitely being against Texas, and maybe Ole Miss being a close second there as well. So obviously got a lot of time left before we will be watching those games take place starting this next January, but we're not going to have to wait as long for Shane Beamer and the football program to get things underway. And they're going to have a lot more experience on this team that's going to be playing this next season. We'll talk about the returning production and what it could mean, or maybe not mean, for the Gamecocks in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team both faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So in essence, if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free today. Terms and conditions do apply. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. South Carolina's football program, it's got a bit more experience, a few more veterans on their roster heading into the 2024 season, but that's not going to be a guarantee that things are going to get better or even worse in 2024. Now, Bill Connolly, who is the ESPN analytics guru when it comes to this stuff, he released his returning production numbers for every single FBS football program just a couple of days ago. And according to his numbers, South Carolina is returning 65% of their production from last season. And yes, that does include transfers. That is a 10% increase from what South Carolina was bringing onto the field in the 2023 football season. Now, going back to their 65% return production rate for this offseason, that's tied for 48th nationally and 8th in the SEC. Now, having brought all of that up, the next question you might be asking is this going to automatically correlate to more wins, or could it somehow actually mean South Carolina loses another game or two? Well, when looking back at the data from this past season, looking at teams who ranked at a certain spot in return production and how they performed, this is what I sort of came up with. So the top 4 teams in return production last season in the SEC were Texas A&M, Missouri, Auburn, and Ole Miss. All of those programs saw a positive change when it came to their win-loss record. Texas A&M and Ole Miss, for example, won 2 more games in 2023 than they did in 2022. And by the way, this is just the regular season, not including bowl games. Missouri won 4 more games in the regular season this past fall than they did 2 years ago. So clearly, if you're in that top 4 range, it's almost a guarantee you're going to do better on the field the following season. Now, The middle five is where things start to get a little bit muddy, and this is the group that South Carolina is going to fall into this next season. So for last year, going back to the 2022 offseason, LSU was 5th in returning production. They did not gain any wins or have any extra losses on their resume this past fall. Kentucky, which was 8th on the list, and by the way, that's the same slot South Carolina's at for this offseason, they also did not see an increase or decrease in their win totals. Same deal with Georgia, but granted, obviously, Georgia, you kind of have to take them out of the mix because Georgia is Georgia. They're just a cut above everybody else, obviously, when it comes to the SEC in football. Vanderbilt was 6th in returning production in the conference this past offseason, and they lost 3 more games in 2023. Tennessee was 7th, and they lost 2 more games. And then the bottom 5, you have Mississippi State, South Carolina, Arkansas, Florida, and Alabama. Again, this is still talking about this past year in terms of returning production. Mississippi State and South Carolina both lost 3 more games. Arkansas lost 2 more games in 2023 compared to 2022. Florida lost 1 more game, and Bama, who ranked at the very bottom in this category last offseason, they won 1 more game. And again, you kind of have to take them out of the equation when it comes to this because that was still when Nick Saban was the head coach, and Alabama was still Alabama to a certain extent. Not saying they're going to fall off a cliff now under Kalen DeBoer, but again, Nick Saban, little bit different when it comes to talking about the head coach that is leading Alabama. So now that we've gone over all of that, you could see some pretty obvious trends at the top and bottom. If you're at the top, you're winning more games. If you're in the bottom 5, you're probably dropping a couple more games. If you're in the middle, it's somewhere in between. In this case, last year, nobody won more games, but more than half of those teams didn't win more games or lose more games than they did in 2022. So when I look at the returning production numbers for this year in the SEC, the thing that stands out to me at the top and the bottom is there's no massive outliers. The gap between number 1 and number 14 this past offseason in terms of returning production was 40%. This offseason, the gap is only 27%, obviously a 13 percentage point decrease compared to last year. Then we will look at the average returning production percentage for every SEC team. You look at the 2023 numbers, it's 62.43%. 2024, it's around 58%. So, little bit less experience overall in the conference this year makes sense. We're another year off now of the COVID year that took place in 2020 that gave all these kids an extra year of eligibility. And what all that means is this: the SEC should be a lot more competitive this upcoming fall. So is that a good thing for South Carolina? Not even including the fact that Texas and Oklahoma have now been added to the mix. You got to deal with the Sooners this year. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. But obviously, there's not really a whole lot that Shane Beamer could have done, in my opinion, this offseason in order to make this team that much better. I think that if you look at the guys that they did bring in, Beamer clearly prioritized getting guys that had multiple years of experience in college football. You don't see a whole lot of first year or second year or even third year players that he got in the portal. You see a lot of fourth year guys, fifth year guys. Heck, I think even a couple of 6-year players that they got in their portal haul this offseason. And speaking of all of that, Shane Beamer and the staff, they might not be done in the portal, particularly along the offensive line. And there's an interesting trend that's developing that leads me to believe that Beamer is trying really hard to ensure that South Carolina coaches, players, and fans don't have to see a repeat of what happened last year with the offensive line once again this upcoming fall. I'll talk about all of that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in 30 minutes or less. Okay, let's talk about some more portal recruiting here for South Carolina. Yes, the transfer portal window for the spring has closed, but South Carolina has not gone away quietly, at least to this point. South Carolina is still eyeballing a couple of guys out there, and one of them that has been made publicly known is Chattanooga offensive lineman Colin Truitt. Now, it was reported, I believe, firstly by 24/7 Sports national college football writer Chris Hummer last week that the Gamecocks had officially offered Truitt. Truitt is a sixth-year transfer, and he had a Pro Football Focus grade of 48.9 and 179 total snaps in 2022. He was a freshman All-American at the FCS level in 2020, and from what I could tell, he did not play a single snap in 2023, I'm assuming due to injury. But I'm not really here to talk about Colin Truitt. I'm sure that he's a really good kid. I'm sure he plays really hard. But the reason I bring all this up is this. Shane Beamer, if there's one thing obviously that went completely off the rails for him and this entire staff this past fall, it was the health of the offensive line. And yes, I know some people would probably say even if the offensive line was 100% healthy and nobody got hurt, it still was not a very good group. And I would agree with you in that regard, but it certainly did not help that position room, the fact that so many guys kept going down and practice reps got all muddied up. If there's one position where you need to have chemistry, besides quarterbacks with their wide receivers, it's got to be up front along the offensive line, because it's a group of five guys that have to all execute and perform their assignments perfectly in order to even give their quarterback a chance to make a good play. If just one guy messes up, the entire play could be wrecked. It could lead to a turnover. There's a ton of bad results that can come about when something like that happens. So, because of all of that, I think that what Shane Beamer is trying to do here, and I think that that's evidenced with the Colin Truitt interest here, is he and the staff are trying to add some insurance basically at the offensive line position. Essentially, guys where you probably are hoping you don't necessarily have to lean on these guys for a significant portion of the 2024 season, but just in case something does happen, or gosh forbid, you see around a dozen or so injuries again this upcoming fall, you've got more experience there, you got some more depth there to where you're not going to have to lean on true freshmen once again. If you think about it, that's what happened this past season. South Carolina had to basically play Tree Babalade and a Trevon Baugh for the majority of the season in their starting lineup. And thankfully for them, it seems like that they nailed both of those guys in terms of getting them and projecting what their talent level could be at the collegiate level. And those guys played admirably. But you cannot run into that situation, obviously, every single year. It's not always going to work out well for you at the end when it comes to having true freshmen stepping in at a position as important as the offensive line. And going back to Shane Beamer trying to find more insurance at the offensive line position, Colin Truitt is not the first player that South Carolina has reportedly contacted after the transfer portal window has closed, as they were also looking at guys like Ohio State transfer Enoch Vimahi, I believe I pronounced the name correctly, hope I did, and UTEP transfer Stephen Hubbard. According to 24/7 Sports, those two guys were expected to take visits this past week here at South Carolina. Now, don't know if those actually ever took place. I know that Vimahi has already committed to another Big Ten program since that report came out, so he's pretty much off the board. Stephen Hubbard might still be out there, even though I believe he's currently committed to Vanderbilt. So, what was the trend here? What was the similarity between those two guys and Colin Truitt at Chattanooga? Well, Vimahi was a sixth-year transfer, and Hubbard was a fifth-year transfer. So between those two guys, along with a Colin Truitt, that is a total of 17 years, going on 17 years, of college football playing experience. So it's very clear to me, Shane Beamer, they're looking at basically not just anybody, but they're looking for some more experience along the offensive line to try to add some more depth, some more insurance there, so that, again, if something goes awry in that position group this next season, maybe some guys just don't perform all that well, or, again, a bunch of injuries take place, you're not going to have to throw a Cam Pringle out there, or maybe a Blake Franks, two guys that probably need a little bit of time to develop before they're ready, or Josiah Thompson, where the only thing you really wonder about with him is size. Obviously, Thompson has already worked really hard in the weight room, and when the spring game happened, ESPN, their little graphics said he was up to 300 pounds, so that's already a good sign. But obviously, got to be still a little bit heavier, got to add a little bit more weight to that frame if you're going to take on Power 5 defensive linemen and edge rushers for at least 3/4 of the regular season. So, be interesting to see if anything comes about with that Colin True recruitment or anybody else that the staff might pursue over the coming days at the offensive line position. But with that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are y'all's thoughts on the SEC slate that South Carolina's women's basketball program is going to have this next season, both at home and on the road? What are your thoughts on the returning production numbers for South Carolina's football team and what that could mean for them in the 2024 season? And lastly, what are your thoughts on the efforts of this staff recruiting experienced offensive linemen out of the transfer portal? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watched today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @aline_SC. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.